Okay, are y'all ready for this? Let's get this party started. All right, let me make sure it's all set up and all working. My internet is notoriously slow. Okay, so here we go. Are you guys ready to review? I'm gonna give it a couple more minutes just to make sure anybody else wants to get in. Make sure you've got your comprehensive 1450 to 1715 worksheets. That's what I'll be going over. We're going to be looking today at the transformation of modern society, or the modern society. So mostly looking at the Renaissance, Reformation, the rise of the nation state. This is really just to make sure this is all going to work for us, right? Because that's the whole goal. And of course, I've got my Italian coffee cup with me because, you know, that's how Miss Jones rolls. Pixie may show up every now and then. She's laying right next to me here, so don't be surprised if she barks. It'll happen whenever a noise happens. Right. Just remember, you can ask any questions through the live chat. So if you have any concerns or any issues about what I'm talking about, you can definitely go ahead and just type in those questions and it should show up for me. All right, looks like a couple more people are joining in, so I'm going to give it a few more minutes just so everybody else can get all the information they need. All right, and I'm going to be eating too because it's morning and I'm hungry, so cheers. All right. This is pretty weird, not having to look at you guys. I wish I could teach this way more often. It'd be nice, wouldn't it? Sitting on my couch at home when you guys are in the classroom. I can handle that. Okay, let's go ahead and get this party started. So, if you were at the review session last Wednesday, you know, we talked a little bit about the background of Western civilization, those kind of things that influenced the beginning of modern civilization and European history. And of course, the most important thing that we talked about was looking at kind of what we get from the Greeks, right? So the Greeks and the Romans are going to heavily influence Western society, particularly when we are looking at things like science, philosophy, the way that the human mind and the human body works. It's going to be a really heavily influence of what kind of people are looking at, people are talking about. So as we get into the Renaissance, as you no doubt remember, the Renaissance is very much heavily influenced by this rediscovery, right, of kind of Greek and Roman society. So I mentioned at the review session on Wednesday, kind of basically what happened is during the Middle Ages, a lot of these Greek and Roman texts had been lost or had been kind of ignored because they weren't religious texts, right? Because that's what the Middle Ages was all about. But as people during the Renaissance started to rediscover Arabic translations of these texts, or kind of started to bring these texts all about, then eventually what we're going to get is kind of this rebirth of classical society. And that's what the Renaissance is. So there's a couple terms, of course, for the Renaissance that are super important for you. So the first one on your worksheet there is secularism. So remember, secular basically just means anything that's not the church, right? So worldly is another way of saying this. So what we see is people less focused on the church as the center of their lives and more focused on worldly pursuits, whether that's money or education or art. It's this idea that I can now do things in this lifetime to help me, and it doesn't have to be church focused, it doesn't have to be religious focused. Kind of gives the people of the Renaissance a new sense of independence, a new sense of humanity and what I'm all about. And there's definitely also this glorification of humans as a part of that. So as humanity is starting to grow and change, humans are the focus of society now, not the church, right? which leads us directly into humanism. Okay, so humanism is kind of that big term that you always kind of have to keep in mind. This reinterest in classical art and classical philosophy is a big part of humanism. So when you're looking at humanism there, the first thing you should always think of is classicalism, right? So humanism and classicalism, very heavily linked. So this is also a reinterest in education. So that's a big part of humanism. So this idea that we should be learning to read and write, maybe even in the vernacular, not in Latin, which was something really big. The idea that power is knowledge, right? So when we are learning, these are the things that are going to really help us sort of progress in life. The glorification of the mind is a big part of humanism and what that is all about. Interest in letters and writing. And again, the Greek and Roman influence of that is very evident because they're looking back to these Greek and Roman philosophers and what they were saying and what they were doing to make it a really big deal here. So there's two different kinds of Renaissance, right? There is the Italian, which begins in around 1350 in Italy and goes for the next couple hundred years. And then there is the Northern Renaissance, which begins when when Northern artists and philosophers come to Italy and then bring that knowledge back to their homelands. So the Italian Renaissance, again, is that very heavily influence of classical antiquity. The perfection of the human form is a big part of that. The regard for the individual, right? This idea that the individual is the most important. And we see that in pieces of art like the School of Athens, right? So by Raphael, where we have Greek and Roman philosophers who are being exalted for the things that they did. It's a really important piece of artwork. Or Michelangelo's David, where we see the kind of perfection of the human body and all of its kind of glory. So we've got, you know, the Pope who is patronizing these artists, right? We've got the Medici who are showing that, hey, you know, you don't have to be a religious person in order to have power. You can be a banker, you can be a merchant, right? And then as it moves into the Northern Renaissance is a little different. So there is a little bit more of an interest in the North in the religious aspect. You got to remember the Protestant Reformation is going on at the exact same time. So religion and conflict within religion plays a very big role in that. The merchant class is going to be the main patrons in the Northern Renaissance. So they're going to be looking to kind of show off themselves and show off their achievements. Kind of the idea of the human soul is a lot more important in the North. So we see kind of a big shift there. And the North really is heavily influenced by the Protestant Reformation. That's kind of one of the things that you really need to keep in mind with the North there. So the Renaissance, as we know, is primarily an artistic movement and an intellectual movement. You definitely need to have, you know, people like Machiavelli, people like Da Vinci, who are very heavily influenced the idea of the Renaissance man, you know, is this ideal human form. So that's really what we've got kind of going on there. We also have, during this time period, the rise of the modern nation state. Okay, am I going too fast for anybody? Tell me to slow down. I can slow down, right? I know I'm going quick. I don't have any responses, so I'm just going to keep going. So remember, during the Middle Ages, during kind of the period before the Renaissance, people didn't really think of themselves as a nation, right? It's more about who your Lord is, where you live, the region that you live in is what's a lot more important. This is especially true in places like Italy, where it's not unified, but even in places like France and England, where your province is a lot more important than your nation, right? And again, that makes sense too, because your king is not as important as the Pope or as your religious identification. But this really kind of starts to change with these new monarchs who are in charge of these new nation states. So a new monarch is the king who is the centralized power. We have a strong king The king sets up a working bureaucracy, right? So he, gives jobs to different people. They report back to him. It's the end of the feudal system, decreasing the power of the nobility, right? So the noble is no longer as important. The king does not depend on the nobility anymore. Now it is about the loyalty to the king, not the lord, not the manor, right? So getting rid of that manorial system that's especially there in France and England for sure. The royal domain now is what's more important. There's also this alliance between the king and the city. You really see this in people like Ferdinand and Isabella, right? So they united two separate countries with their marriage, and they go around to the different cities to say like, hey, we're your king and queen, get to know us, right? This is going to increase loyalty for them. So you've got those kind of examples. We also see the tendency that we're starting to get that absolute monarch, right? We're not quite to absolutism yet, but we're moving in that direction where the king has complete control. The king is starting to take power over the church, over the nobility. And remember, this is mostly happening in Western Europe, right? So we see this happen in England with Henry VII. We see this happen in France with the Spider King, right? We talked about him. With Ferdinand and Isabella in Spain. We're not seeing this much in like the Holy Roman Empire, right? Because they're still kind of doing their own little thing. We definitely don't see this in Russia yet. Russia is going to be feudal for a long time. But kind of some of the accomplishments that come along with this is, again, that consolidation of power. There's going to be more effective control of the economy, right? The economic interests of the state are a lot more important. Exploration comes out of this, right? Because you think Ferdinand and Isabella are the ones who are sending off people like Columbus, right? So it's this idea that the state becomes more important than the individual region. So in terms of some specific examples in these different countries, so Spain has that strong monarchy. They are wealthy, right? They're going to be one of the most wealthy people in this time. Spain is one of the strongest powers during the Renaissance. They don't really have a lot of domestic development, because you remember, Ferdinand and Isabella, they're going around and they're conquering and getting the Moors. They're driving out the Moors before they unite. And so that's really kind of big with what's going on there. In France, the power of the king kind of fluctuates a little bit depending on who's in charge, right? So, and depending on, if it's a strong king like the Spider King or whether it's kind of a weaker king, right? There is going to be some religious and political turmoil, right? Because the people of Spain are not France, excuse me, are not 100% sure which, are they going to be more loyal to the king or to the Pope? So there is a little bit of that. So in England, the strong monarchy is going to be kind of the strength of England from the War of the Roses through the Tudor dynasty, and really until the constitutional crisis with the Stuart dynasty. So the monarchy is going to be the strength of England for a while. They are good at fostering trade in England, so England's pretty good at that. Then, of course, we've got our powers who are not as strong. Poor old scapegoat Poland, right? Poor old Poland, they have some, their nobles can't really agree on anything. They're not really able to unite and support the king. So Poland's monarchy is starting to collapse. They're a very agricultural society. We didn't get huge into Poland, but it is important to know that Poland is a very declining society at this point. There is no middle class in Poland. And that's going to be a big issue, especially as we're seeing the growing middle class in these other new monarchies, right? The middle classes be more important than the nobility, and Poland doesn't really have that. The Holy Roman Empire is just kind of chaos, right? You can kind of summarize the HRE in this time as pretty chaotic because really they don't have a lot of that central control. Being all of those small separate states, everything's a little nuts. Charles V is probably the most important leader of the Holy Roman Empire through this time period. You definitely need to know Charles V and kind of the things that he did. So I would write his name down. But again, especially when we start throwing the Reformation into the Holy Roman Empire, it's pretty chaotic for them. Now, We also can't forget that we've got the Ottoman Empire kind of hanging out on the outskirts of Europe, right? So the Ottoman Empire is different from the rest of Europe because they are Muslim, right? They are the major Muslim power. And they're also kind of European, but they're also kind of Asian, right? So the rest of Europe, they're not really sure what to do with the Ottoman Empire. And for a while, they're kind of a perpetual nuisance, right? They're kind of always on the fringes, really ready to kind of go against the rest of Europe. But while they're pretty strong in the beginning of this period, we are going to see the the Ottoman Empire starting to decline through this point, right? So just a couple people who are important through this period. Of course, we have Niccol Machiavelli, right? We can never, never, never forget Machiavelli. He is one of the most important authors of the Renaissance. Of course, the author of The Prince. He is really the first guy to write a political essay, right? And his political essay about, the ends justifying the means and what it takes to be a strong leader, that's really going to be the playbook, really, of these European monarchs. Just my computer here. So it's going to be the playbook for these European monarchs. People like Henry VII and the French monarchs, they're really going to look at Machiavelli as kind of a how-to guide, how to be really important. Thomas Hobbes, so we talked about him a little bit recently with the Enlightenment, but he is actually much earlier. I think that's kind of important to note. His main book is the Leviathan, right? That's Leviathan, Leviathan. And just in case you're not sure what that term means, it actually refers to a sea monster that's mentioned in the Bible. And basically what he uses is the Leviathan as an analogy. And he basically says, people suck, right? People are bad. People cannot control themselves because they are just inclined towards evil people. And in order to kind of keep the people under control, we need a strong monarchy, right? So he really likes absolutism. That's Thomas Hobbes' big thing. And then, of course, we've got John Locke, who is the opposite of Thomas Hobbes. He writes the two treaties of government, okay? And his idea is this idea of a contract government, okay? So basically what that means is that the government is in a contract with the people it rules. And if the government breaks that contract by failing to protect the people have the right to replace that government, right? He's also the life, liberty, and property kind of guy. And again, I know that this sounds kind of like, isn't this more Enlightenment? But these two guys are actually a little bit earlier. They're going to go on to influence the Enlightenment, which is why we talk about them with the Enlightenment. But they are actually definitely much earlier in the 16th century compared to the rest. And then, of course, as I mentioned, Charles V, very important name. He tries to unite the Holy Roman Empire under a universal monarchy. He fails at that, but despite his failure, he does do a lot for the Holy Roman Empire. You might also remember he is also the King of Spain because his mother was Juana la Loca, right? So Juana the Mad. And so he unites Spain and the Holy Roman Empire for a while. That's why both Spain and the HRE are Habsburg-controlled powers during this period. The Habsburgs are the major controlling of those two. And so Charles V really loses power in his attempts in exploration of uniting kind of the world and the rest. He is also the one, yes, Aaron asks, is he the one that prosecuted Martin Luther? Yes, he is also the one that does that. So he plays a big role in the Protestant Reformation as well. So kind of going along with that, the next thing on your list is the Peace of Augsburg. So the Peace of Augsburg is kind of the culmination of Martin Luther's work with the Protestant Reformation. It kind of ends the first phase of the religious wars. So you might remember when Martin Luther is kind of doing his thing in the Holy Roman Empire. It leads to a lot of Protestant rebellions, and it leads to a lot of conflict. And the Peace of Augsburg was the one where was the compromise between Charles V and the Protestant leaders, where he basically said, all right, here's the deal, guys. All right, if you want to be Catholic, you can be Catholic. If you want to be Lutheran, you can be Lutheran. But here's the key, the big but, right? It has to be depending on your prince or the leader of your area, right? So if your prince in your specific German territory wants to be Lutheran, everybody in his territory's got to be Lutheran. If he wants to be Catholic, everybody in his territory's got to be Catholic. So it's not an individual, idea, but it is that first kind of compromise between the Lutherans or the Catholics in Germany. And then finally, we have the Treaty of Westphalia. So this one's the really big one that ends the 30 Years' War, right? This is definitely a treaty you should know. So 1648 is the end of the 30 Years' War. That is a date you must remember for this class, 1648. End of the 30 Years' War. This ends the second phase of the religious wars that recognizes some of the sovereign states in the Netherlands and the Holy Roman Empire. And it also is the conclusion of kind of you get to choose whatever religion you want to be, right? It's that ultimate compromise that says no longer, it doesn't depend on your leader anymore. It's now a personal choice. If you want to be Lutheran, be Lutheran. If you want to be Catholic, be Catholic. If you want to be Calvinist, be Calvinist, right? So the Treaty of Westphalia is really the end of the universal church, right? Before the 30 Years' War, before the Protestant Reformation, there's one church, and that one church is the Catholic Church. Treaty of Westphalia puts an end to that, right? So what we're going to see instead is this division of Christian churches throughout Europe. So kind of this leads us right into that Reformation section here. So let's kind of look at where this comes from and why this happens. So the causes of the Reformation, you've got three different causes. We like to think of this as being mostly religious, but it is also a political and economic problem in the Holy Roman Empire. So for the political side of it, it kind of comes out because of these new monarchies. Right? So we've got this shift in monarchy, this shift away from the church being the most important thing. We're no longer in the Middle Ages anymore, where the church is the most important thing. Now that the monarchy is the most important thing, people can start kind of questioning the church, questioning what they believe. So that's kind of that first part. In terms of economic issues, in a lot of places, particularly in England with Henry VIII, the monarchy starts to seize church land, right? So when Henry VIII switches over to Church of England, he's taking the monasteries and their wealth. So that's a big thing. So there is the seizure of church land. Because mercantilism is beginning to be promoted, that's a big part of it. The church had actually had some restrictions on commerce. And so now that the church is becoming less important, people feel like they don't have to listen to those restrictions anymore. And basically, in terms of religion, people start to question the teachings of the church. There's this interest in what happens after I die, right? There's this interest in, is the church really teaching the right things? People start to question the Catholic Church because, during the Renaissance, the church had become a little corrupt. You think of these popes who are in it for the money and the power, not for the religious side of it. So as the church is beginning to be corrupt, people start questioning the church. And they're like, I don't really know if I'm into what you're saying anymore. There's this idea that we have to purify the church. You think about guys like Erasmus, right? That's really what they're all about. We'll talk more about Erasmus in a second. And then, of course, there are people who are coming up with totally new ideas about the church. People who are saying I'm interpreting the Bible in a different way than the church is. And I think that my way is right? But none of this really is going to come to a big head until Martin Luther, right? So Martin Luther, probably one of my favorite people in history because I really believe Martin Luther's split from the Catholic Church drastically and changed European history for good. So we've got this little German monk who never feels like he's good enough, right? You remember we watched the film on it, and he just always feels like, everybody's out to get me. God's going to damn me to hell. It's going to be bad, right? Once he starts reading the Bible and starts teaching himself, however, he comes up with these new ideas. So the first is faith, right? Faith being the most important thing for salvation. You don't have to follow church rituals anymore. You don't have to buy into the indulgence thing. All you have to do is believe that God will save you, and God will save you, right? That's huge. We also have this idea that the church, or the Bible rather, should be the basis of the church, right? Not the other way around. So before this, the church is telling people what to believe, right? The church is telling you the Bible's written in Latin, so nobody can read the Bible for themselves. Now Martin Luther is saying, well, maybe people should be able to interpret the Bible for themselves and should be able to say that the Bible is that number one foundation. So remember, one of the things that he does is that he actually translates the Bible into German, right? So that's a really big step. He also is going to be kind of the leader of, I lost my train of thought there. Never mind, forget what I was about to say. I'll get back to you later on that one. But again, Martin Luther's, he goes to the Council of Worms. That's where they try to prosecute him, where Charles V tries to say, we're going to excommunicate you. We're going to, arrest you for this. He escapes and manages to basically lead the biggest revolution of European religion, probably for all time. Of course, once Martin Luther starts to do his thing, other people start to say, hey, well, I've got my ideas about the church too. The biggest one being John Calvin. So John Calvin is our predestination guy. He's the guy that says God has already predetermined who will go to heaven and who will go to hell, right? So he's the guy that's going to really be, he's about the elect. You'll hear that term, the elect, right? So he's actually kicked out of France. He's originally Jean Calvin. He's French, right? So he goes to Geneva, and in Geneva, which is in Switzerland, he starts his own community, which is a theocracy, right? So his community, the church, runs the government, right? And he kind of legislates morality up there. You might remember on one of our tests, we had the picture of the drunks who had been beheaded and put their heads on pikes. That's the kind of stuff that went down there. He actually appeals to the middle class. John Calvin is going to be really popular in Scotland. It's going to be really popular in the Netherlands. He's going to be the foundation of the Puritans. So the ones who are, like this Puritan work ethic where the church says that, God helps those who help themselves. And so I'm going to work really hard. And that's how I'm going to show that I'm super religious. And I'm going to be really moral and really good. And that's really John Calvin. So I'm actually going to skip Loyola really quick and go to Erasmus first. So Erasmus kind of showed the need for reform. He comes before Martin Luther, remember? I don't really know why they put him last on this list, because he really should be first. So he comes before Martin Luther. You might remember there, I gave you the phrase, Erasmus laid the egg that Martin Luther hatched, right? So he calls for reform of the church and for the unity of the church. He used sarcasm and satire in his writings. He never promoted a break from the church. He just wanted to kind of fix what was wrong. And that's why they kind of left him alone. And Martin Luther actually originally was doing the same thing. He was saying, let's just fix what's wrong. But then he realized the church had absolutely no interest in fixing what was wrong, right? Then, of course, as the Catholics are seeing all of these Protestants breaking away from the church, they decide that it's time for them to start fixing, kind of saying, okay, well, maybe there are some problems in the church that we're going to deal with. And so this is where Loyola comes, Ignatius Loyola. So he is the guy who's basically in charge of the Catholic Reformation, right? Or kind of the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation. And he is the leader of the Jesuits, right? So the Jesuits are a branch of Catholics who are big into missionary work. They're big into education. They are kind of like the Renaissance response from the Catholic Church, right? They're the humanist of the Catholics. They focus on faith and good works, right? Where Martin Luther says it's just faith, Loyola is like, no, you got to do good works too. That's where salvation comes from. And that's really what the church is kind of sticking to. And of course, Loyola is loyal to the Pope, right? Loyalty to the Pope is key, right? And that's really what the Catholic Reformation is all about, right? It's reaffirming those beliefs. Just some other terms that you need to know. Of course, we have the Habsburgs, right, who are the ruling family of the Holy Roman Empire. Charles V is a Habsburg, so we've got that. We've got the 30 Years' War. That is that major religious struggle in Central Europe between Protestants and Catholics. This is the one that starts when the guy gets thrown out of the window, hush Pixie, and goes for, you guessed it, 30 years, different phases of the 30 Years' War. So you've got the Bohemian phase and the Danish phase. But the real good summary of this is the culmination of religious struggle in Europe, particularly in Central Europe. So Central Europe is the Holy Roman Empire. Then we've got the word I can't say, right? But I'm going to try just for you guys, right? The Schmuck League, right? The Schmuck League. I don't know if we ever used this word in class. I'm pretty sure we didn't. But these are basically just the princes who were opposed to Charles V, right? These were the ones who supported Martin Luther. So they kind of got their own little group together. So if you remember the end of the movie Luther, when all of the princes got together in front of Charles and they're like, we're not going to submit to you. These are the ones who are pushing for the Peace of Augsburg. Then we have the Inquisition. So the Inquisition is the Catholic Church's trial that they do for people who are heretics, who are going against the church. The goal of the Inquisition was to maintain religious conformity. So this idea that you got to stay loyal and conform to the Catholic Church. Of course, this is biggest in Spain with the Spanish Inquisition in 1492, where Ferdinand and Isabella are driving out the Jews and the Moors. So that's a big part of that. Moors, remember, are the Muslims in Spain. Then we've got the Anabaptist. So this is another group of Protestant reformers. These guys are very left-wing. They are so extreme that other Protestants don't really like them. They're going to be kind of the foundation for the Amish in America. So they are the ones who say, like, you should be baptized as adults, which is where their name comes from. But yeah, these are the ones who are so radical that even Martin Luther thinks they're crazy. Right? That's who these guys are. Then we, of course, have the French Civil War. So the French Civil War is a conflict between the Huguenots, right? I'll actually write that word in the comments. There you go, Huguenots, and the Catholics. So on the side of the Catholics, we have Catherine de Medici, okay? So she is the queen. So Aaron, real quick, going back to the Anabaptist, he asked what made them radical besides the baptism beliefs. Basically, they just said that people had freedom to do their own thing, right? And that was radical at the time. The idea that people had the choice, right? That people could live their life the way that they wanted to live their life. That's really what made them radical. And it doesn't seem very radical to us today, but it seemed pretty radical to them. They also were very anti-church and state, right? Now, Luther was anti-church and state too, but these guys kind of took it to another level. So that's kind of something else. You don't necessarily have to know the specifics of what made them radical, at least for the test. You just need to know that they are radical, right? So that was a great question, Aaron. So going back to the French Civil War here really quickly, we've got Catherine de Medici as the control of the Catholics. We've got Henry of Navarre, who is in the charge kind of the Protestants in the French Civil War. So the French Civil War begins with the St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, where Protestants are basically pulled out of their beds, pulled out of their homes, and murdered in the street. Eventually, it's going to resolve with Henry IV, Henry of Navarre becoming Henry IV of France, and he says this really famous phrase that Paris is worth the Mass, right? So his compromise is that I'm willing to convert to Catholicism in order to end all this conflict. But he also issues the Edict of Nantes, right, which makes it legal to be a Huguenot, right, which makes it legal to be a Protestant in France. So that's kind of the culmination of the French Civil Wars. The next one that we have here is the Council of Trent. So the Council of Trent was the kind of Catholic Reformation meeting, essentially, where the Catholic Church kind of got together. They had this big meeting, and they said, all right, well, what we're going to do is we're going to set up some reforms for the things that we think are wrong in the Catholic Church. So basically, like corrupt priests and stuff like that. Like, we will reform those things. But we're also going to reestablish those beliefs that we have, right? Those beliefs that of faith and good works, that the Pope is the one that's in charge. We're going to reaffirm that we believe those things as well, right? So the Council of Trent is kind of the culmination of the Catholic Reformation. And then, of course, the last one here we mentioned before, the Huguenots or the French Calvinists, right there at the bottom. So the last thing we're going to cover today is the I think I'm just going to stop with the economic revolution, okay? And we will come back to the rest of this next week. So kind of wrap this up. So the economic revolution is kind of the beginning of change of the economy in Europe. So the opening of the Atlantic shifts trade from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic Ocean, right? So that's kind of how the whole period of exploration began, right? Is that we're doing trade for trying to get to India through the Mediterranean route. But of course, we've got the Italians and the Muslims who control the Mediterranean. East or Western Europe is like, we got to find our own way to control that. So that's where the Atlantic trade kind of starts to become in. The goods that they are looking for mainly, oh, here's Pixie, are gold and silver, of course. Got to have that money, 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 right? And then, of course, we have spices, right? That's what they're getting to India for. They're also looking for timber, wood, right? Europe's running out of wood, essentially. And then there is a pretty big fur trade that's going to come out of that. So the commercial revolution just refers to the nation as the center of economic development. So basically the government is the one who is controlling the economy, mercantilism, that kind of thing. So the effects that we have here of the commercial revolution, eventually, this is going to lead to modern capitalism. As we know, mercantilism is not the same as capitalism, but it is the foundation for that. So that is going to be the belief of that. The rise of the entrepreneur, right? So the idea that you can run your own business and kind of start your own wealth. So those are the economic effects of the commercial revolution. The social effects are the rise of the middle class, the rise of the bourgeoisie, right? Both in numbers, so there are more people who are able to gain wealth, but also in wealth, right? The merchant class, we think of them as being poorer than the nobility, but in fact, many middle class people were richer than nobles, right? A noble is almost always in debt. Their wealth is really in their title, not necessarily in their cash flow. Merchants have more cash. That's really what it comes down to. And so this rise of the middle class is going to be really, really important for where Europe is going. So the next that we have is the political effects. So governments begin to finance their own standing armies, right? So that's a huge political effect. The king is now dependent on the middle class, not the nobility, right? So that's a huge idea of it. In terms of a religious effect, Calvinism becomes bigger, right? So remember, I said Calvinism, people who are Calvinists are all about hard work. The Netherlands is a great example of this. They are a Calvinist state. So the Netherlands are all about that really Protestant work ethic, right? We work really hard and we gain wealth and we gain it. And if we gain it, it means God favors us, right? So Calvinism is going to rise. And the more wealth you have, the better God likes you, right? That's essentially what that means. And then in terms in intellectual, there's going to be a broader understanding of the world, right? As we start to influence or come into contact with new nations, it's going to influence the education system of Europe, right? And it allows us also to kind of encourage scientific inquiry, which is going to be a direct lead-in to the scientific revolution. And then finally, we of course have the all-important mercantilism, right? So mercantilism, remember, means exports over imports, right? You want to export more than you import, okay? That is the central theme of mercantilism. Also with mercantilism, we have state-sponsored economic policies. So the government is in charge of the economic policy, right? Not the guild system, not, you know, the individual merchants, the government. Of course, we have Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who is kind of the leader of that in France, right? But this kind of allows you to promote your own national interests, right? So your country economically becomes more important than everything else. You know what, I'm actually going to go ahead and to do the scientific revolution really quickly too, because that's a good kind of ending spot. So I'm just going to really quickly go through each of these things here. So the scientific revolution is about inquiry now, scientific inquiry. It's also the point where we change from the geocentric theory to the heliocentric theory. So the Earth being the center versus the sun being the center of the universe, and all of the implications that come from that, right? Both religious and intellectual. So specific people that we have who contributed to it. Francis Bacon is the concept of experiment, right? Experimentation. That's kind of what he did, that scientific method, right? That comes from Bacon. Copernicus is the first heliocentric theory guy. He's the one that's going to influence all of the other people. Kepler says that the planet orbit is elliptical, so like a oval, right? Not a perfect circle. Most people thought that the orbits were perfect circles. Kepler's like, nah, man, it's probably, I think it's an oval. I think it's an ellipse. So that's where that comes in. Galileo, of course, also the heliocentric theory. He also pushes the scientific method. And as we know, of course, Galileo makes a much bigger name for himself than Copernicus, which is why the church kind of got the attention of him. And then the Isaac Newton is that the universe is governed by a natural law, right? So like laws of gravity, laws of kind of an object in motion will remain in motion, right? He's all about natural law, that the universe kind of has certain things that this is the way the universe runs. And then of course Descartes, he is also kind of the development of the scientific method. Geometry is a big one for him, and kind of the ability to reason. I think, therefore I am, right? So using your brain, not your heart. And then of course remember that the scientific revolution is anti-Aristotle, anti-Greek science, right? Should probably add that back into number one, anti-Greek science. So the impact we have here, philosophy, it's going to lead to the Enlightenment, new ideas of government. On religion, it's going to have conflict between faith and science, right? Some of this is not even going to be settled for much later. Galileo is not Galileo is not forgiven by the church until 1990. 1990, Galileo, the Pope actually goes, you know what, we are bad, Galileo. You were right, we were wrong, our bad, which I'm sure he really appreciated 500 years later, right? Great job. And then, of course, this is also going to lead to religiously the development of deism. So the idea of God as a clockmaker that set the world in motion, right? We talked about this with the Enlightenment. That comes out of the scientific revolution. And then, of course, in the world, it's going to challenge the traditional beliefs of society and the application of science to social problems, right? Which we see when we get into the French Revolution and some of the other changes in the Enlightenment. So that was a good 45 minutes covering that first part of that worksheet. Next Saturday, we are going to go over more of that. I think there's a really, or not next Saturday, sorry. After that, the Saturday after that, because next Saturday is spring break, and I will be driving to Orlando, so we will definitely not be covering it then. But if you have any additional questions about any of this, please feel free to send me a remind text. Pixie, hush. Sorry. We will try to get everything you need to do. Remember, I'm always going to be after school for an hour or so on Wednesday, so if there's something you missed, if there's something you're not sure about, I will be there for you. Otherwise, have a great Saturday, you guys. Have a great Saturday. 4-4. Which one was that, Erin? I'm not looking at my sheet anymore. Let's see, D4. The economic revolution, is that what you're looking for here? I'm assuming. So the effects of the commercial revolution. Let's see. So we're looking at the beginning for economically, the beginning of modern capitalism, the rise of the entrepreneur. Socially, we're looking at the rise of the bourgeoisie and the middle class in terms of numbers and wealth. Politically, standing armies and the king more dependent on the middle class. Religiously, we're looking at the rise of Calvinism. And intellectually, we're looking at an increase in scientific inquiry and a broader understanding of the world, right? So I hope that was what you needed there. And again, of course, I'll always be available after school as well. So I'm going to go ahead and log off here. Have a great Saturday, you guys, and I will see you on Monday morning.